At the bottom of a crack barely wider than a human head, in total darkness, 2 cavers found the bones of at least 15 people. Nothing that size should have been able to reach this place. They were more than 30 meters underground, deep inside a South African cave, and the only way in was a vertical fissure in the rock that pinched, in places, to about 18 centimeters. And yet the floor was scattered with the dead. That was 2013. The cave was called Rising Star in the limestone hills northwest of Johannesburg, in a region long nicknamed the Cradle of Humankind. The 2 cavers, exploring passages mapped for decades, had squeezed through the crack expecting nothing. What they photographed instead would pull an entire field of science into an argument that is still not settled. The bones did not belong to a modern human. When specialists examined the first images, the anatomy was wrong in fascinating ways. The skull was small, far too small, but the shape of it, and the teeth, and the hands looked like something from the human family. This was not one skeleton, and it was not one animal. It was a species no one had ever described. They named it Homo Naledi. Naledi means star in the Sesotho language for the cave that held it. To reach the fossils, the team faced a problem of pure geometry. The chamber lay at the far end of a route that included a climb up a jagged wall of rock nicknamed the Dragon's Back, and then the chute itself, a twisting drop of about 12 meters, pinching down to that 18-centimeter gap. Most adults simply could not fit. So the excavation was carried out by a small group of slender scientists, recruited through an unusual public call for researchers who were also experienced cavers and slim enough to pass through a gap the width of a hand. All 6 chosen were women. They threaded their bodies through the crack and worked in the cramped dark below, single file, in a place where a careless movement could crush a fossil or wedge a person, while cameras relayed everything to a command tent on the surface. Over weeks, they brought up more than 550 fossil fragments. That number is the first real turn of the mystery, because 550 pieces is not one unlucky individual who wandered in and died. Those at least 15 individuals were not all adults in their prime. There were infants. There were children. There were old individuals. There was, in effect, a cross-section of an entire population. The very young, the very old, and everyone between, gathered in one of the most inaccessible spaces in the cave. So the question wrote itself, and it has never gone away. How did they get down there? Consider what Homo Naledi actually was, because it sharpens the problem. It stood roughly 1.5 meters tall and weighed perhaps 40 to 50 kilograms. Its hands were remarkable, capable of a precise grip, yet with strongly curved fingers, the fingers of something that still climbed. Its feet were almost entirely human, built for walking long distances. Its legs were long, but its brain was tiny, around 500 cubic centimeters, less than half the size of a modern human brain, closer to the brain of an Australopithecus that had lived millions of years earlier. This was a mosaic, an ancient-looking head on a body built to walk the modern world. For a long time it was assumed a creature like this, with a brain that small, could not have done anything deliberate with its dead. That assumption is precisely what the chamber attacks. Start by ruling things out, because that is how the case was built. The first suspect for any pile of bones in a cave is water. Flash floods can carry carcasses through underground passages and dump them in a heap. But the sediments in the chamber told a different story. The bones were not sorted the way flowing water sorts things, and there was no sign of the coarse rubble a flood would have swept in alongside them. Water, therefore, was not the answer. The next suspect is predators. Hyenas, leopards, and other carnivores drag prey into caves and leave a very particular signature behind: gnaw marks, puncture wounds, cracked bones emptied for marrow. The Naledi bones carried almost none of this, and there was a stranger absence, too. Predator dens hold the bones of many species. Whatever the hunter caught and dragged home. This chamber was overwhelmingly Naledi. The only other remains were a scattering of small creatures, birds, rodents, the kinds of animals that can find their own way into a cave and simply die there. There were no antelope, no big carnivores, none of the larger animals a flood would have washed in or a predator would have carried. No hunter hoards a single kind of prey, of every age and nothing else, in a spot this hard to reach. So the ordinary explanations fall away, one after another, and the field is left with an uncomfortable short list. Either these individuals traveled into the chute themselves and could not escape, a slow, repeated death trap that swallowed the young and the old alike, or something carried them there on purpose. Neither option is comfortable, and that is the point. A death trap has to explain why so many would keep entering a pitch black vertical crack over what may have been a long span of time. Deliberate placement has to explain how a small, brained relative came to move its dead into the dark at all, a behavior that, until recently, science reserved almost entirely for large-brained humans and Neanderthals. There is one more twist that makes any single tidy explanation harder. The Naledi chamber was not the only place in the cave that held these bones. In 2017, the team announced a second chamber, roughly 100 meters away through the same system and reached by its own difficult route, holding the remains of at least 3 more Naledi. Among them a strikingly complete skeleton the team nicknamed Neo. Whatever process delivered bodies into the deep, dark heart of Rising Star, it appears to have happened in more than one hard-to-reach place. Coincidence becomes a harder argument to make twice. It does not help that Naledi was, physically, a capable climber. Those curved fingers and mobile shoulders mean the species could plausibly have negotiated the walls and squeezes that defeat most modern adults. That cuts both ways. It makes a self-inflicted death trap more believable, and it also makes the deliberate carrying of a body through the dark more physically possible. Critics have raised a different possibility altogether. That hundreds of thousands of years ago an easier entrance existed, one that has since collapsed or filled in. The team argues the cave's geology shows no trace of such a passage. Whether one ever existed remains genuinely unresolved. Then the dating arrived, and it made everything harder. When the fossils were finally dated, using several independent methods, the result was not what most researchers expected for such a primitive-looking creature. Homo naledi was not millions of years old. It lived, at least at this site, somewhere between roughly 335,000 and 236,000 years ago. That places this small, brained species in Africa at about the same window in which the first members of Homo sapiens were taking shape on the same continent. That single fact reframes the whole chamber. This was not some distant ancestor fumbling in the deep past. This was a cousin, a separate branch of the human tree, not a direct ancestor of modern humans, living at the same time as early Homo sapiens and apparently doing something with its dead that looks eerily familiar. It is worth pausing on that word, cousin. Homo naledi was not a rung on a ladder climbing toward us. It was a separate shoot on a branching family tree, small, brained and long-lived, that overlapped with our own origins and then disappeared. A relative, not a stepping stone, and the temptation to call what happened in that chamber a burial becomes almost irresistible. And that temptation is exactly where the science turned into a fight. In 2023, the team that found Homo naledi went much further than the bodies ended up here. They announced that they had found deliberate graves, bodies, they argued, laid in shallow pits dug into the chamber floor and then covered over. They reported marks scratched into the cave walls, cross-hatched engravings they suggested Naledi had made, and they described traces of fire, soot, burned bone, what they interpreted as small hearths. Taken together, the claims painted a small brained hominin that buried its dead, marked its walls, and carried fire into the dark. If true, it would be one of the most important findings in the whole story of human behavior. Evidence that the roots of symbolic, ritual life run far deeper and reach into far smaller brains than anyone had allowed. But much of the scientific community did not accept it. The criticism was sharp and it was specific. A grave is not proven simply because bones lie in a hollow. A decomposing body naturally settles, slumps, and comes apart. Sediment shifts around it, and telling a dug pit from a natural depression demands exacting analysis that critics said was missing. Independent researchers re-examined the sediment claims and reported that, in their assessment, the evidence did not support deliberate burial. The wall engravings were undated and could not be securely tied to Naledi rather than to someone who entered the cave much later. The fire evidence was questioned as well. Several formal peer reviews concluded that the extraordinary claims had outrun the data, and that the findings had been broadcast to the public, including in a documentary, before that scrutiny was finished. The disagreement has not resolved into a clean verdict. In later rounds of review, one specialist came to accept parts of the burial argument, others remained unconvinced. At least one publicly disputed the team's suggestion that reviewers broadly agreed. This is what a genuine scientific dispute looks like from the inside. Not a mystery solved, but a claim under pressure, being tested in the open. So it is worth being precise about what the dark chamber does and does not establish, because the honest version is remarkable enough without inflation. Here is what is secure. The bones are real, and there are a great many of them. They belong to a single, previously unknown human relative with a strikingly small brain. They lie deep inside a chamber that is extraordinarily hard to reach, and they represent individuals of every age, from infants to the old. The evidence argues strongly against a flood and against a predator's den. That much is not seriously in doubt. Here is what is not secure: whether other Naledi deliberately carried and placed those bodies, whether any of them dug a grave, whether the marks on the walls were made by Naledi hands, whether the species controlled fire. Each of these is a possibility the chamber permits, and not one of them is a fact the chamber has yet proven. That gap between what has been found and what people want it to mean is the real story of the Naledi chamber. It is deeply human to look into a dark space full of the dead and see a funeral. The evidence does not yet allow it, and still the core puzzle stands undiminished. Somehow, in near total darkness, at the bottom of a crack that barely admits a living person, the bodies of at least 15 small, brained members of a lost human relative came to rest. The infants and the elders together, by a rote and for a reason that cannot yet be explained by any ordinary means. Whatever the final answer turns out to be, the chamber has already done something rare. It has forced a science that prizes its own caution to stand at the edge of a hole in the rock and say, out loud, that it does not know how they got down there.